Before we begin, I want to thank Bill Cook, who has figured out a way to digitally record my sermons. And so today he's going to be recording, and I'll take a breath in a minute, and he'll be able to edit these, and we'll be able to load these online as podcasts. So you can listen to them if you're not here, or share with your friends and family. We also will continue to have the video on our Facebook, private group page, where you can see the video if you'd like. We're just trying to find new and different ways to reach out to a world that's increasingly using all kinds of technology. If you pay attention to even things like NPR, there are all kinds of programs with podcasts, etc. So pray for me, because now I'm like, oh my God, I'm digitized. I'll be cast farther. So we pray for God's blessing as we try just another avenue of outreach to get the message of Jesus Christ out to the world. Well, I had hoped today to have the choir learn a song that I grew up singing. It's an old gospel song from my childhood in the 60s and 70s. That might not seem so long ago to many of you, but I am in my 50s, so that's still a ways away. But the song was called "I Want to Be a Follower of Christ." And the word said, I want to be a follower of Christ. I want to be one of his disciples. I want to walk in the newness of life. I want to be a follower of Christ. And the little bridge said, what do I have to do? What do I have to say? How do I have to walk each and every day? Tell me, what does it cost if I carry the cross? I want to be a follower of Christ. I have never pledged a sorority. Many of you may have. They weren't allowed on my college campus at Harvard and Cambridge. My roommate ultimately pledged a sorority that had a Cambridge, Massachusetts city base for Delta Sigma Theta, one of the larger African-American sororities. And it included women from colleges in the area. If you know Boston, you know there are just so many different colleges and universities in that area. And while I acknowledged the benefits of affiliation and sisterhood and the sense of belonging, I just wasn't a big fan of the process. I didn't want to be grilled by people. I didn't want to have to do weird stuff in order to be considered okay and welcome to join. Last year's ministry intern, Danielle Cox, pledged a sorority at her college, and she has described for me the whole rush process. And if you know Danielle, she's very eager and such a leader and very involved even now in reaching back to that sorority chapter to be sure that they're handling the process right and making that process as welcoming as it can be. Unfortunately, sorority pledging and fraternity rushes and pledges can often be a very divisive process, and it can make some people feel like they are not welcome. My husband Walter pledged during his senior year at Northwestern while he was doing the student teaching. That just doesn't seem like a really smart thing to do. He has lots of interesting stories, which he probably is not supposed to have told me about the process, and one involved huddling up with his line brothers, a group of people who were pledging, in some weird hotel on Howard Street, the dividing line between Chicago and Evanston, and another about being led out into some open field, blindfolded, and having to find their way back. Just doesn't seem like a process you'd want to go through just to belong to an organization. He, by the way, pledged Alpha Phi Alpha, the first black fraternity. They are proud to claim Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as one of their brothers, so I suppose there is some benefit to doing that. At our wedding reception, the brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha stood around Walter and I and began to sing their hymn. They had forgotten the words to their chapter's sweetheart song, so they decided to sing the hymn. They began singing, they were off key. They couldn't get on the right note together. Walter, of course, stopped them, got them back on the right note, and they began to sing. And I started laughing. And one of them said, Terry, this is serious business. You are an alpha wife now, and you must respect our traditions. The guy was not joking. has gone to many anniversaries of the chapter. It's the Alpha Mu chapter. Whenever I meet a guy who says he's an alpha, I tell him my husband's an alpha. They want to know what chapter. They're surprised that I know the chapter. There's a secret handshake. If you look at the back of Walter's car, he's got a license plate that says Alpha Phi Alpha. Their colors are black and gold. When we were getting married, most of the groomsmen in my wedding were Alpha and Phi Alpha brothers. They wanted to know, why aren't your wedding colors black and gold? I don't like black and gold, I said. I'm the bride. You may belong to lots of civic organizations. Organizations have rituals, they have rules, they have things that you're supposed to do in order to be considered duly a member. You may pay annual dues, you may have to cycle through certain activities. There's an organization that was founded years ago called Jack and Jill, which was started by a group of professional African Americans trying to provide enrichment activities for their kids. Well, in order to be a member of Jack and Jill, you have to be invited by a certain person who's a member, and you have to commit, at least in my last recall, you have to commit to sponsoring so many activities for the kids. So while it's a prestigious thing to be a part of, you have obligations. So we have codes of conduct. There may be a uniform, an insignia, special gala that you have to be a part of. Walter had the privilege of attending the rehearsal this past week of the Choral Airs, a chorus with which Martha Anderson sings, and she was pleased to have him there. Walter teaches 2 gospel ensembles at Columbia College in the city of Chicago, and he uses the Choral Airs as part of his curriculum. He shows them videos of their performances. He is amazed at their musicianship and wants the kids to see that it's not just for gospel, but there are lots of other genres of music for which just vocal discipline is really important. Walter said these women rehearse from 7 to 10 without a break. If you're going to be a member of the Choral Airs, you got to be at rehearsal from 7 to 10. You pay dues to participate, you buy uniforms, you travel. There are a lot of things that you have to do to be a part of this organization. So, symbols, commitments, all of these things mean that you belong, and we all like belonging. Well, when Jesus comes along, John the Baptist has recently been arrested, and it's really only at this point that Jesus actually actively starts to recruit. After his own baptism, he is really just operating among those who would define themselves as disciples of John. And when he calls these first disciples in the text that Bob read for us, he simply says this: "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of people." These guys were fishermen. He met them at the base of the lake. He makes the connection with what they are already doing in order to describe what he wants them to do. Well, if you've ever read the Gospel of Mark frequently, you'll notice that the word immediately pops up all the time. He's always describing immediately this. Jesus said this, and immediately. And Jesus does this, and then immediately. Well, Jesus says, "Follow me," and immediately what? They leave their nets and follow him. It's hard for us to imagine being at work. Think about that, being at work, and someone says, "Hey, I want you to be a part of this thing I'm doing." And you drop what you're doing, and you leave your job and go to do it. The only explanation for this is that this is the 1st century, not the 21st century. Most of us wouldn't be able to just leave our jobs and go do that. But these people were essentially self-employed, so they could fish here, they could fish tomorrow, they could sort of arrange their schedule in order to do what they needed to do. Even in the 1st century, though, to pick up and just follow someone who said, "Follow me," with no real case being made other than to say, "I am going to make you a fisher of people." Jesus eventually calls, as we know, 12 of these men. They are not high society men. They are not rich. They are not rabbis or scholars. They are people who are fishers Fishermen who are tax collectors, who are just regular Joes living in Galilee. They are, however, looking for a Messiah. In this culture, as we've studied in Sunday school, there are lots of people who are claiming to be miracle workers and messiahs, and so they have in their head one thing, Jesus has on his heart quite another. And so for 3 years, as these people live and walk and talk with Jesus, they are being prepared, little do they know, to actually carry on what Jesus wants them to do. So what did being a follower of Christ mean? It actually meant something very different for the disciples than it meant for most folks. If you read the text throughout the Gospels, there are always these people, the followers, the multitude of people who hear Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount. There are people coming to him for healing. You could probably walk about 10 miles a day in that part of the world. And if you've ever been to the Holy Land, if you were in a city called Tiberias, which is on the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, when I was there several years ago, the tour guide told us that if you're standing on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, you can actually look around and see the shores of Bethany, where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived. So I can imagine that if you heard that Jesus was in Bethany, and you could arrange it in your fishing schedule or whatever it is that you did for a living, you might pick up and take a day's journey and go to see where Jesus was. Most of us are not picking up and going to hear people in different cities. Certainly not ministers. There may be a favorite minister that you like and he offers a conference and maybe you're going to travel across the country. And there are some ministers who draw that kind of crowd. But to do that in this day is a very unusual thing. So what have the disciples actually done? What makes them followers of Christ? And more importantly, what makes us really followers of Christ? Well, first of all, they are issued a call. Most of you would say, I'm not called, Terry, to ministry. Oh, yes, you are. You may not be called to ordained ministry, but you are called to something. There is something that God has placed within you, a gift, a talent, a passion. That passion is usually the key to it. Dixie loves being treasurer. I'll just use her as an example because everyone knows this. She says it all the time. Most of you probably would not love being treasurer. I like writing, I like reading, I like studying, I like teaching. I think I'm well suited to do the things that I believe God has called me to do. I would not like being treasurer of a church. I have budget responsibility at the Divinity School. Thank God there are budget analysts and other people who can help me with that task. But every one of us has been equipped with certain gifts, and when the call is extended, the first thing we have to do to be a follower of Christ is accept the call. The call may be as simple as an invitation to accept Jesus as Lord and Savior. And when we make that confession, wherever you did it, as a child, as an adult, no matter what the denomination was, whether you were confirmed or not confirmed, sprinkled as a baby or baptized as an adult, at some point you responded to the call to be a Christian. You can't be a Christian without responding to the call of Jesus Christ. You just can't do that. All the denominational differences and traditional differences that we have, and even when we say in essentials unity and non-essentials liberty and all things love, there's some basic stuff that we have to sign up for as Christians, and one of them is the Lordship of Jesus Christ. And for far too many Christians, the followership ends there. We've made the response to accept Jesus, and then we're content to just come to church, be in the pew, or not to come to church. Most people, when they're given a survey and asked what their religious affiliation is, they'll check Christian. If you were to say follower of Christ, I bet we'd get far different responses because that seems more imposing. That seems somehow to demand something when we say I am a follower of Christ. If we just confess Jesus but there is no action, there's no service, then there really is no witness, and we have no opportunity to set the example as Jesus did, to let people know really who God is through Jesus Christ and how we and the world really can be because of that. The disciples also responded not just by picking up and going, but they were extremely loyal to Jesus. They didn't always understand why he did what he did and why he said the things that he said, but they didn't want people getting too close to him. Jesus wanted people to get close to him. They were very protective of his time. On the Sermon on the Mount, after the feeding of the 5,000, they're like, Jesus, how are we going to feed all these people? He's like, bring food to me, find out who has food. And one of the disciples finds a little boy who's willing to bring forth his loaves and fishes. The other disciples are a little skeptical. It's like, that's hardly enough. And it's only when Jesus blesses and they distribute it, and they have baskets left over, that they understand that Jesus isn't trying to keep people away from him. He's trying to draw people to him. Just like the disciples, we can also sometimes misinterpret or misread what Jesus' real priorities are. The disciples didn't have a New Testament. They didn't have a book. All they really had were the teachings of the Jewish scholars, and they knew the promises and the prophecies of the Messiah. The only reason that we have Jesus' teachings in the New Testament is because people listened and remembered, told them orally and shared them orally, and ultimately people started writing them down. We live in an age where we actually have a record, as best as has been gathered, of what Jesus taught and what he did. And one of the reasons I'm such a proponent of studying the Bible is it's because it's the written record, the best written record we have of the teachings and priorities of Jesus Christ. Every organization that you belong to has constitutions and bylaws, and you learn the history of why we're doing this, and this symbol means this. It's the same in the Christian church. The problem is we make too much sometimes of history and man-made symbols and man-made rules, and we're not paying attention to what Jesus says and what Jesus wants. In conversations that I have with people who are disillusioned by Christianity, we have a fellow who joins us for one of our outreach activities, and he's always saying, the Pentecostals this, and Christianity has done this, and Constantine did this, and these people are doing this, and the evangelicals and the liberal Christians this. What they're responding to is not the heart of Christianity as Jesus has presented it, not Jesus' example. It's what human beings have done to the message of the gospel. It's what human beings have done that really violate the heart of the gospel, and they're doing it in the name of God and in the name of Jesus. But we're not in a position to actually be able to filter out the bad from the good unless we know what Jesus' priorities are and what he taught. So if we want to be followers of Christ, we need to know as much about Jesus as we can. We need to be able to discern and wrestle with difficult texts, and we need to pray together for wisdom and discernment. We need to respond by confessing him as Lord, but we also need to know as much as we can know about who he is, so that we can be the best examples of following his teaching that we can be. We may not always understand, just like the disciples, but we certainly need to try to model and live out what Jesus has taught us. And most importantly, Jesus gave them a final commission to go out into the world, and that commission follows on to us. Once we've responded and we learned as much as we can, we have an obligation to share and to reach out and to go out. We do things like pads, we do have our back to school fair. Many of you are involved in organizations that do ministry and service throughout the community, with or without the church. We reach out to Belarus. We're followers of Christ, set his example, and aren't afraid to share that example. We say all the time that our back to school fair, lots of people are handing out backpacks. Lots of people are giving out school supplies. Not everybody's offering a free carnival in addition to that. But we could be a part of a civic organization, the Knights of Columbus or the Junior Women's League. The reason that we go out and share is because Jesus has told us to. And we can never forget, as followers of Christ, that the reason we do what we do is because he loved us and gave himself for us and asked us to reach out to this world. So I want to be a follower of Christ. I want to be one of his disciples. I want to walk in that newness of life. I don't understand how you are able to handle the ups and downs of life, but I want what you want. I want what you've got. I want to be a follower of Christ. Well, what do we have to do? What do we have to say? How do we have to walk? Tell me, what does it cost? It will cost something, because people don't understand why you give up your Saturday morning to go meet with a group of leaders from your church. They don't understand why you may work overnight at pads to ensure that somebody not only has a decent evening meal, but a wonderful breakfast. They may not understand why you're always headed to your church for meetings. They may not understand how important your own devotional time is, because you want to not only respond to the call, but you want to learn as much as you can about Jesus. They don't understand that you've got to live this thing, not just come to church on Sunday. People won't understand, but your example can help them understand. Jesus famously said in John 17, Lord, make them one. As I always joke and say, not so they can hold hands and sing kumbaya, but so that people will look at them and say, wow, look at those people. They do what they do because they are followers of Christ. And so there must be something to this Jesus thing, this Christ thing. What an opportunity to respond to Christ's call, to learn as much as we can about him, and then go out as he commanded us to. That's what it takes. I want that because I have already experienced the love of Christ. So maybe you've responded to the call, but you haven't yet gotten to the point of understanding you need to learn as much about Christ as possible, and that you need to really reach out. I want to be a follower of Christ. I hope you do too. I hope you'll join us and everyone else in this church in not only responding to the call, but learning as much as we can, so that we can be the most effective witness and service across the world, across our neighborhood, sending the message that through Jesus, God was reconciling the world to himself. And because of that, we have a message that says God welcomes all to join this wonderful relationship with God. Join me in being a follower of Christ. Amen.